Let me preface this by saying I don't think I've ever felt quite as lost doing Rumination as in this game, with possibly the exception of SMT4. Maybe the Personas. It's not like this isn't my thing, but at the same time, I'm starting to suspect that it kind of isn't. And I don't know, I was having a really hard time getting a grasp on anything. I have very few notes on my things, and rather than going through and kind of discussing things sequentially or bringing out moments of any given scene, well, I'm not really going to be doing that, because most of the time when I'm doing that sort of a thing, it's discussing character motivations or nuances of dialogue or voice acting or animation. But since this plays and feels in many ways like a PSP game, no offense intended, but the problem it's kind of the similar problem I had with the Xenoblades, actually, or not Xenoblades, excuse me, Xenosagas, because there's a lot of very long stretches of scenes where people are basically just talking and nothing's really being conveyed or communicated. And I'm just like, okay. Now, that being said, they do at least bypass one of the problems with animations. There's a lot of animation attempt, mostly about the reunion. All the class members going, "Oh my God, Reed, you're alive!" Glomp, glomp, or when you meet your sister right at the beginning, or Fee, who literally jumps off a cliff to land on you. Just little things like that. It helps, absolutely. But there's large, huge swaths of time where I just didn't write anything down because I was just like, huh? It feels, if I were to put it into terminology, like I'm watching an episode. And I don't mean that as a bad thing, but I mean more like episode 2 of like 87 or something like that, which is appropriate because near as I can tell, that is actually the truth. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, part 4 still has not come out in English as of the time of me recording this. So, yeah. And when I say part 4, I should clarify, I mean part 4 of the Cold Steel series, because there's the Sky series, there's Cold Steel series, I know there's the Crossbell thing, and then there's like AO or something like that. I feel like I'm still missing a few there. I don't know. I have no idea what I'm talking about. And that's basically the point of this preface. I have no idea what I'm talking about. But this is my job, so I'm going to do the best I can. The gameplay felt in many ways pretty similar to the first one, the combat overall. I really have nothing to actually say about that. But what I do have to say is I like the overall structure of the gameplay narrative in this one a lot better than the first one. First one had the structure of, we're in school. Duh, right? This time it feels more like, okay, we're running around trying to put the band back together, for lack of a better way to put it, and also doing the bidding of Oliver, which I'll talk more about that in a minute, but I do like how, thanks to not only the structure of the game, but the inclusion of the Courageous, which is awesome, that we have more, it feels more free, even though it kind of isn't. It gives it more of an adventure feel. That's the wrong word. It gives it more of an epic feel. That's the word I want to use. Iliad style, as we're moving our way across Erebonia, and to a few other areas as well. It was just nice stuff, is all I'm trying to say, and I like that. I also do like I like Valinar's overall significance, both in, obviously I'm kind of talking about story time, because he's the one who actually has the detectors for the secondary contracts. But what I mean by that is combat-wise, I do like how playing as Valinar was a nice little shift from playing as the squad, the team. And I do like how they made a point of having regular intervals of, okay, now we have to fight as Valinar rather than fighting as the team. It was just nice stuff. I liked it. I'm with it. I do hate those chests, though. First time I walked up one, I was like, ooh, that looks like a really fancy chest. Red, little ornate things. Awesome! Ah! I should have known. I don't know what the heck was wrong with me. I should have known. One small complaint. Actually, before I move forward, I forgot about the other thing about the Valinor. I like how, narratively, Valinor is slowly regenerating power, which makes sense because it kind of naturally forms a power progression curve just by moving through the game. There's actually a term for that, and I'm not sure what the official term is, but I usually call it narrative-based progression rather than level-based progression. In other words, at certain points in the narrative, you gain a power boost, leveling you up, thus making you better. And that's how Valinor felt for the most part of the game. Anyways, I do want to mention one thing that kind of bothered me about this game. And I know I've said this before, and I'll probably say this again. I dislike the inconsistency of the voice acting. What I mean by that is there were several scenes where someone would be like, hey, what do you think about such and such? And then there'd be a line which isn't voiced. And then there'd be another line that isn't voiced. And maybe like 5 or 6 or 10 other lines that isn't voiced. And then all of a sudden there'd be a line that's voiced. I don't mind lack of voice acting, and I don't mind voice acting, but I really mind inconsistent voice acting, and it's always been something that's bothered me, so that got to me a bit in this one. But it's whatever, I was reading fast when they were talking for the most part anyways. So, welcome to the mountains. It's been a month. Enjoy the coma. Things are good, things are good. And I do like it. I think it's funny how it took until the second game for the doomed hometown trope to take into effect. Although you notice they completely subvert that because the hometown's actually fine and no one's actually dead. But we get our first peek into what I believe is referred to as ogre form. Now this is where I'm going to start getting a little bit about some of my terminology, because I went to look up a few things to clarify because I was lost for a decent chunk of this game. And as a consequence, how do I phrase this? It's really hard to find any information on this game, at least in English. And even what I found was clearly not written by a native English speaker, so even in that case, that might just be a translation. But I bring that up because I was having a really hard time distinguishing certain terminologies and words. So if I screw up, I apologize. My bad. I do want to mention one thing. The game has a really weird directing style. I wrote down one specific scene because I think this scene helps to exemplify it better than any others. So, it's the scene where you're invading the place on the railway, and you're walking along, and all of a sudden, wait, there's a bomb! And then we see the Jaegers, the Zephyr Jaegers. It's like, okay, then we fight. And then the mechs show up, and then the tanks show up, and then the sniper shows up. And it was just, I don't know how to explain it. It felt so weird to me. This isn't exclusive to this scene. This is a regular thing throughout the game where it's like, but then this, but then this, but then this, but then this. And it's just, in some cases, it would go like 3, 4, or 5 steps within a single sequence of scenes. And it just, okay, that's cool. I'm cool. I guess it's a deliberate stylistic choice. It just left me sitting here going, half the time. I do also want to mention that the game goes out of its way very far to emphasize just how both sides are bad, which is going to bring me to my first real discussion point. So we've got the Reformists versus the Noble Alliance. Now, my first automatic assumption was the Reformists were the good guys, or more good guys, and the Noble Alliance were the bad guys. This is probably most... I mean, obviously, Duke Cayenne, which I keep wanting to say Cyan, Duke Cayenne is probably one of the better examples of this, being Mr. I'm noble, But in addition to that, very, very early on, there's a scene where... Oh, God. I'm trying to think of the name of the town, and I can't think of it. It's very early on. And you go into this town, and there's... Did I write down her name? Please tell me I wrote down her name. Rosine, yes. Rosine is being sexually harassed by 2 of the local guards. And it's just, whoa, game, Jesus. She's also underage. That just makes it even worse. Underage to drink, to be more clear. She's like 17 or whatever, high school student. And it's just, okay, you're just going to jump into that game. All right, that's horrible. It's okay, though. We managed to convince them to leave by making them take a bribe from a merchant. At least that's what they think happens. And I remember sitting here thinking, really? That's the direction? Okay, they're super evil. Got it. We'll have to kill all of them. I understand. But what's weird is they don't really do much to make the Reformists any better. In fact, the game goes out of its way many, many times to emphasize that both sides of the conflict are, what's a good word for this? Evil. Yes, that's a good word. That they're both bad guys. Now, narratively, this makes sense, since we are not on either side. And because originally I thought we would just kind of end up sidling up to the Reformist side, or just stay out of the Civil War entirely. But since the Civil War forms so much of the narrative framework of this game, no, we're totally getting involved in the third faction. The Olivert faction is what I want to call that one, because, let's be honest, that's kind of what it is. The neutral faction, which isn't evil. which makes sense because you need at least one non-evil faction, right? Otherwise, it's just Warhammer 40K. Nobody wants that. So, on the one hand, I kind of get what they're going for because, war is bad and there's no such thing as a good, just war for the most part. But, see, the thing is, as I was going through, I started to think that wasn't actually their point. Or, to put it another way, it feels like rather than trying to make a point about how war is about two factions, both of them are bad, fighting each other, it felt more like it was a allegory, not an allegory, like foreshadowing? There's these inferences every now and again of a curse, the most obvious example being Reen himself and the ogre thing that he goes through, which I don't understand, of course, because I'm an idiot. But we do see a couple... I don't know. I'm probably just pulling this completely out of a hat, but I feel like this is the way it's constructed. It feels more like laying down foreshadowing for a future plot point rather than just everyone's horrible here. And I point that out because the game also bothers to go out of its way to showcase that there are plenty of people who, to put it as simply as possible, aren't horrible. So is the theme of the game the fact that only the horrible are the ones in power? Or is the theme of the game the fact that there's horrible things that we have to contest? Like, you can see why I'm just having a hard time getting a grip on this. As I've said before, it feels very much like this episode, excuse me, didn't do that on purpose. This game ends on and then tune in next week kind of a note, right? And I'm just sitting here like, okay, I'd like to tune in next week. But that's not my job to tune in next week, so I suppose I'll just have to find out next year, maybe. I don't know. Anyways, I'm getting off topic. The two factions, though. One of the things I find interesting, so we see Cayenne. I want to talk about him briefly. I've talked before about the difference between someone who wants to rule because they want to rule, and someone who wants to rule because they want the benefits of rule. Cayenne is a weird one for me, because at first I thought he was very definitively one of the, I want to rule for the benefits of rule. Yes, everything should be ostentatious and fancy, and, yes, the chocolate icing, please. But as the game went on, and as more things were revealed about him and his history with the fake emperor and blah, 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 I found myself realizing that what he is, in fact, is someone who is a true, as I would terminology it, someone who is a true zealot. An actual zealous noble. Now, that's even more dangerous and terrifying to me. Obviously, the whole cause of the Noble Alliance is we should rule. By divine right, the nobility should be on charge, and we should be above the commoners, and the feudal system is what should remain, and blah, 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 right? And yet, and of course, he should be the one on the very top of the heap, because he is the one who, by right of blood, which is the only thing that matters, and, it's just... You get the idea that the man actually believes his own drivel, which I'm not sure if that makes him worse or better. It definitely makes him more dangerous, I will say that. A sniveling toady who just wants a really fancy shower every night isn't as much of a threat as someone who believes they have a divine right to command other human beings. So, but what I find interesting is Alberea is shown in contrast to him as someone who is a believer without getting to the point of being a zealot, but also being someone who probably wants to rule, although, of course, his inevitable, Iron Bloods thing is kind of related to that. But my point being that he's someone who definitely believes in a cause, but not to the zealous nature that the other dude, that Cayenne, comes to. It's just interesting to see the contrast there, because, okay, one of the reasons I struggle with this game is because it feels like, how do I phrase this? It feels a little bit too willing to whitewash characters, to show people who are villainous or evil or do bad things, and yet the party regularly interacts with them as if it's a Tuesday over crumpets. The tonality of it kept just making my brain downshift on the highway. It's like, wait, this is someone who has actually been manipulating you and just kidnapped your sister, and you're just going to have a casual conversation with them, as if nothing was happening. Probably the worst example of this by far is Crow. Now I know that Crow ends up dying as a consequence of the game, spoiler alert, and redeemed himself through death, but my point is, this doesn't feel like an in-character, I'm trying to think how to phrase this. This doesn't feel like an in-character thing. It feels like an out-of-character thing. If it was in character, that would make a degree of sense because it would showcase that these people are kids with, to put it as bluntly as possible, a skewed view of perspective. A skewed view of perspective? Really, Laura? A skewed value scheme. Like they don't really have an understanding of consequence or of evil or of good or of what really matters or what doesn't matter or investment or anything. They're kids. Okay, I get it. But instead it feels like the game itself is being presented in a manner where it's like, it's not a big deal. Don't worry about it. It's not a big deal. One of the only people who's actually vilified is Orbone, which, speaking of which, so he wins, obviously, just comes out of nowhere. Hey, I'm going to be real for a second. I actually forgot who he was because it's been over a year since I played the first one. And I've only played the first Sky game. So it was just like, huh? Okay, go to Google. And of course, Google was no help because, as I mentioned earlier, there's really very little information on this series. Pretty sure I spoiled myself about a couple of things about him, so that's awesome. But, point being, I'm looking at him like, who the heck is he? And yet he comes across as someone who is, well, first of all, Bismarck. But second of all, very clearly, ends justify the means, noble villain, I'm going to do whatever it takes to win. But even he is not portrayed as if he's some kind of complete monster, even though by all accounts he's the one who set into motion all of these events, including the Civil War itself and the invasion and annexation of Crossbell. So, what? Why is he not the bad guy? I'm sorry to say that, but I don't know. I'm just going to move on because I'm twisting myself up in a knot here. Let's move on to the next point. So we've got evil versus evil. We've got the third faction. I've mentioned this idea before, although I don't remember if I did it in the Rumination or just in my own private thoughts to friends and Discord viewers. But I mentioned the idea before that Oliver feels like the actual main character, or if not the main character, the main thread of the Legend of Heroes series. Like across the whole thing, not just any given trilogy or quadrilogy or whatever. Because, ignoring the fact that he's a recurring element, he also tends to be one of the major forces pushing events on a large scale forward. Obviously, in this case, the third faction idea was pretty much entirely his, and pushed and maintained by him and his efforts. And pretty much the main reason we got the Courageous at all was because of him. You'll notice the crew that staffs the Courageous is a nice mix. We've got commoners, we've got nobles, we've got people from multiple nationalities, we've got people from all sides. The entire idea is to artificially as well as metaphorically maintain a value of being the third faction. We're not related to you. We're not related to either of you, the sides here. We're not part of the ILF. We're not part of the Reformists. We're not part of the Nobles Alliance. We're over here. Leave us alone. Because basically, as I said earlier, there's a certain value in having a third faction when it comes to watching the Horde and Alliance. Watching the evil and the other evil just kind of clash for so much, right? Unfortunately, I feel like he didn't get as much screen time as I would have liked in this one, despite the fact that he's one of the major pushers for most of the events of the entire game. I suppose that's true because, well, he's kind of the background thread, isn't he? It's kind of like Kane over on Command and Conquer. He's obviously one of the main characters because he's the connecting thread across multiple games. But each game is told from the perspective of a different viewpoint, in which their view happens to include his story, which is going through their view as they go through it. Also, as a quick aside, this is just kind of off topic, but I think I'd rather enjoy following Oliver than Reen. I didn't really care for Reen all that much. He wasn't bad, it's just nothing about him really struck me as interesting. That being said, one of the things I do like thematically, and this is kind of interesting because this ties into the Oliver and Reen thing, is the thematic idea of, how do I phrase this? Because it's going to sound so stupid, it's going to sound so typically, JRPG, and you're just going to look at me like, well, every JRPG has that theme. Shut up. The point is, it feels like thematically the idea is you need your friends, you need your support network, you need other people. You need the people you can count on, whether they're your friends, or your professional coworkers, or your family members or your loved ones or whatever it is, you need that support infrastructure. Otherwise, it just doesn't work out. Otherwise, it just falls apart. No matter what you are, no matter how strong you are, no matter how much you can outmaneuver your way through the enemy, it doesn't work unless you've got the support infrastructure. Kind of the Batman thing, if I was to be honest about it. As I've said many times, Bruce Wayne / Batman, spoiler alert, is nobody without his support network, right? Same theme. And of course, Reen is learning this. It feels like Oliver has already learned this by the time the game starts, and thus can in many ways impart this lesson upon him. Just the way I kind of perceive that. Looking at my notes here. One thing I want to talk about. Yes. The mythos of this world feels very Japanese. And I don't mean that as an insult. I guess I could say more Eastern, but I don't want to generalize. So I'm just going to go with Japanese because I have studied a very tiny amount of Japanese mythos. The idea of, you've got your spirits everywhere, first of all, right? Tons and tons and tons of the various different types of spirits, and you've got your big ones and your small ones, and the idea being that these spirits are the ones who kind of push and move events forward. Only in the backstory, though. They're not really relevant in the modern stuff, because by the modern times, they've calmed, or they've at peace, or they've become a tree or whatever, right? And I mention that because, first of all, that's a fairly typical take on this kind of a backstory or mythos. But the thing that I found most interesting is that in this case, it's not spirits, it's mechas. And I say that, and this sounds so strange, but I actually like that a lot better than if they were literally elementals or if they were, Onin or whatever. I actually prefer the idea, Oni. I prefer the idea that they are, in fact, mechs. Units that have been built and as a consequence follow a certain ideology because that's kind of how they were built, and thus form this spirit, the same role that spirits would usually take in a backstory, but instead, in this case, they were crafted constructs from I forget the name of it, the really ancient power that was really, really advanced, because there's always an ancient advanced power in these, right? And it also makes me wonder, though, how, for lack of a better way to put it, how sentient and sapient these things are. Obviously, Valinar is more than capable of speech and understanding, but only to a certain extent. To use my own terminology, do these things qualify as full AI, fully fleshed out, realized AI, or are they merely high-functioning or even low-functioning VI? It could be argued that based on what little we see in this game and in the previous game, really, these things, these various pieces of the Great One, only really function as high-functioning or mid-functioning VI, that they are extremely limited by their programming and as such cannot be considered truly sentient or sapient. Now, speaking as someone who is incredibly ignorant of this game and this series in general, I'm basically opening this up for questioning. What do you guys think? For those of you who actually know this series a lot better than I do you think they actually qualify as truly sentient and sapient, or do you think they are merely advanced VIs, the ability to think and reason, but only within a limited framework and not actually being able to achieve full sentience and sapience? But I love that concept because, first of all, because it tilts it on its head, but second of all, because it means that the underpinnings of the world and the way things work were basically established by people deliberately building that. It's one step away from just, okay, so we're going to terraform this world, so let's craft a few, elementals which are going to then take care of the world, that kind of a thing. It's just a cool idea. Let's see, looking at my notes, I talked about Orbone, kind of. Actually, this says Osborne. This says Osborne and this is Orbone. I'm pretty sure it's Orbone. The class being broken up in the ending. Oh yeah, that's something that really weirded me out. What was up with the final boss? The Lucifer thing. It's just, hi, you get nothing for fighting me. Why were we fighting him? I know that sounds so stupid. It's the most recent thing I did. I just finished fighting him like 20 minutes ago, 30 minutes ago, something like that. Why were we fighting him? They even mentioned we're just doing this as our last action as Class 7. I get it. We needed a final boss, and we couldn't end it on the dragon skeletal thing. But I do have to say, for me, it feels like, if I were to try to answer my own question, it feels like this is the last hurrah for the class. One of the things that I understand distantly, even though I've never experienced it myself, is the idea of forming a very strong and emotional bond with a group of people, and then having to say goodbye to that. in other words, the class thing, right? You come very closely connected to your class. Now, I never had that because I hated school, but I can at least intellectually understand that concept because that's what the idea is here. I'm actually not sure if this is going to even continue forward in episode 3, but the idea is, all right, these are my friends, these are my family. I've become so close to them, I've become so connected to them. That's how the game starts, for God's sakes, is him being completely wigged out and constantly worrying about his classmates. And the first, act, 2 acts, 3 acts, however long it actually is, the first chunk of the game is entirely devoted towards making sure everyone is okay, finding them and reuniting them. That then leads to the conclusion here where we end up saying goodbye. It feels like, to put it into another terminology, that the previous episode, Trails of Cold Steel 1, was all about, the first 3 years of high school. And that this episode was the 4th year. That now we have, concluded our tenure as friends and effectively family, and now it's time to say goodbye. And then we break up, and we all will hopefully keep in contact, but that's never necessarily a thing that's going to happen. It's just interesting to think about. Is that it? Is that all I've got? I talked about the Civil War, I talked about Ulvert, I talked about the Ancient Spirits Mecha thing, I talked about Cayenne and Alberea, I talked about Valinar. Yeah, I think that's all I got. I enjoyed my playthrough with this, don't mistake me. I just felt extremely confused for half of it. It felt like it was something that I just didn't understand the reason or point behind a lot of things. In terms of presentation, like I mentioned earlier, with the unusual directing and pacing of scenes, there are large stretches of just chatting, followed by weird stretches of action, which I don't want to say they're badly directed, because they're not. It's just they are oddly directed, which then leads to, the combat and all that fun stuff. Oh, by the way, yes, I was cheating, just to make that clear. I usually cheat for these ones, especially for really long games. I don't have, 50 hours to just sit and play this game. If I was going to do that, I'd be streaming it. But, yeah, that's all I got. I'm sorry, guys. I hope you've enjoyed what little I had to offer to the table. I'll see you next time.